Page 214. The next evening, Dad disappeared. After a couple of days, he wanted me to go with him again to some bar, but I said no. Dad got ticked off and said that if I wasn't going to team up with him, the least I could do was stake him some pool shooting money. I found myself working over a 20, and then another in a few days. Mom had told me to expect a check in early July for the lease on her Texas land. She also warned me that Dad would try to get his hands on it. Dad actually waited at the foot of the hill for the mailman and took it from him on the day it arrived. But when the mailman told me what had happened, I ran down Little Hobart Street and caught Dad before he got into town. I told him Mom had wanted me to hide the check until she returned. Let's hide it together, Dad said, and suggested we stash it in the 1933 World Book Encyclopedia Mom got free from the library, under currency. The next day when I went to re-hide the check, it was gone. Dad swore he had no idea what happened to it. I knew he was lying. But I also knew if I accused him, he'd deny it, and there'd be a loud yelling match that wouldn't do me any good. For the first time, I had a clear idea of what Mom was up against. Being a strong woman was harder than I had thought. Mom still had more than a month in Charleston. We were about to run out of grocery money, and my babysitting income wasn't making up the difference. I had seen a help wanted sign in the window of a jewelry store on McDowell Street called Becker's Jewel Box. I put on a lot of makeup, my best dress, it was purple with tiny white dots and a sash that tied in the back, and a pair of Mom's high heels, since we wore the same size. Then I walked around the mountain to apply for the job. I pushed open the door, jangling the bells hanging overhead. Becker's Jewel Box was a fancy store, the kind of place I never had occasion to go into, with a humming air conditioner and buzzing fluorescent lights. Locked glass display cases held rings and necklaces and brooches, and a few guitars and banjos hung on the pine board paneled walls to diversify the merchandise. Mr. Becker was leaning on the counter with his fingers interlocked. He had a stomach so big that his thin black belt reminded me of the equator circling the globe. I was afraid that Mr. Becker wouldn't give me the job if he knew I was only 13, so I told him I was 17. He hired me on the spot for $40 a week, in cash. I was thrilled. It was my first real job. Babysitting and tutoring and doing other kids' homework and mowing lawns and redeeming bottles and selling scrap metal didn't count. $40 a week was serious money. I liked the work. People buying jewelry were always happy. And even though Welch was a poor town, Becker's Jewel Box had plenty of customers. Older miners buying their wives a mother's pin, a brooch with a birthstone for each of her children, teenage couples shopping for engagement rings, the girl giggling with excitement, the boy acting proud and manly. During the slow spells, Mr. Becker and I watched the Watergate hearings on a little black and white TV. Mr. Becker was captivated by John Dean's wife, Maureen, who sat behind her husband when he was testifying and wore elegant clothes and pulled her blonde hair back in a tight bun. Hot damn, that one's classy broad, Mr. Becker would say. Sometimes, after watching Maureen Dean, Mr. Becker got so randy that he came behind me while I was cleaning the display case and rubbed up against my backside. I'd pull his hands off and walk away without saying a word, and that horn dog would return to the television as if nothing had happened. When Mr. Becker went across the street to the Mountaineer Diner for lunch, he always took the key to the display case that held the diamond rings. If customers came in wanting to look at the rings, I had to run across the street to get him. Once he forgot to take the key, and when he returned, he made a big point of counting the rings in front of me. It was his way of letting me know he didn't trust me in the slightest. One day after Mr. Becker had come back from lunch and ostentatiously checked the display cases, I was so furious that I looked around to see if there was anything in the entire darn store worth stealing. Necklaces, brooches, banjos, none of them did anything for me. And then the watch display caught my eye. I had always wanted a watch. Unlike diamonds, watches were practical. They were for people on the run, people with appointments to keep and schedules to meet. That was the kind of person I wanted to be. Dozens of watches ticked away on the counter behind the cash register. There was one in particular that made me ache. It had 4 different colored bands, black, brown, blue, and white, so you could change your watch band to match your outfit. It had a price tag of $29.95, $10 short of a week's salary. But if I wanted, it could be mine in an instant, and for free. The more I thought about that watch, the more it called to me. One day, the woman who worked at the store Mr. Becker owned in Lohr stopped by. Mr. Becker wanted her to give me some beauty tips. While she was showing me her different makeup applicators, the woman, who had stiff platinum hair and eyelashes tarred in mascara, told me I must be earning a truckload in commissions. When I asked her what she meant, she said that in addition to her $40 a week salary, she made 10% on every sale. Her commissions were sometimes double her salary. Hell, welfare will get you more than $40 a week, she said. If you're not getting commissions, Becker's stiffing you. When I asked Mr. Becker about commissions, he said they were for salespeople, and I was just an assistant. The next day, when Mr. Becker went off to the Mountaineer, I opened the display case and took out the 4-band watch. I slipped it into my handbag and rearranged the remaining watches to cover the gap. I had made plenty of sales on my own when Mr. Becker was busy. Since he hadn't paid me any commission, I was only taking what I was owed. When Mr. Becker came back from lunch, he studied the diamond ring display like he always did, but he didn't even glance at the watches. Walking home that evening with the watch hidden in my purse, I felt light and giddy. After dinner, I climbed into my bunk bed, where no one could see me, and tried on the watch with each of the bands, gesturing the way I figured rich people did. Wearing the watch to work was out of the question, of course. I also realized that I could run into Mr. Becker in town at any time, so I decided that until school started, I'd put the watch on only at home. Then I began to wonder how I'd explain the watch to Brian and Lori and Mom and Dad. I also worried that Mr. Becker might see something thief-like in my expression. Sooner or later, he'd discover the missing watch and would question me, and I'd have to lie convincingly, which I wasn't very good at. If I wasn't convincing, I'd be sent off to reform school with people like Billy Deal, and Mr. Becker would have the satisfaction of knowing he'd been right all along not to trust me. I wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. The next morning, I took the watch out of the wooden box where I kept my geode, put it in my purse, and brought it back to the store. All morning, I nervously waited for Mr. Becker to leave for lunch. When he was finally gone, I opened the display case, slipped the watch inside, and rearranged the other watches around it. I moved fast. The week before, I had stolen the watch without breaking a sweat, but now I was terrified that someone would catch me putting it back. In late August, I was washing clothes in the tin pan in the living room when I heard someone coming up the stairs singing. It was Lori. She burst into the living room, duffel bag over her shoulder, laughing and belting out one of those goofy summer camp songs kids sing at night around the fire. I'd never heard Lori cut loose like this before. She positively glowed as she told me about the hot meals and the hot showers and all the friends she'd made. She'd even had a boyfriend who kissed her. Everyone assumed I was a normal person, she said. It was weird. Then she told me that it had occurred to her that if she got out of Welch and away from the family, she might have a shot at a happy life. From then on, she began looking forward to the day she'd leave Little Hobart Street and be on her own. A few days later, Mom came home. She seemed different too. She had lived in a dorm on the university campus without 4 kids to take care of, and she had loved it. She'd attended lectures and she'd painted. She'd read stacks of self-help books, and they had made her realize that she'd been living her life for other people. She intended to quit her teaching job and devote herself to her art. It's time I did something for myself, she said. It's time I started living my life for me. Mom, you spent the whole summer renewing your certificate. If I hadn't done that, I never would have had this breakthrough. You can't quit your job, I said. We need the money. Why do I always have to be the one who earns the money? Mom asked. You have a job. You can earn money. Lori can earn money too. I've got more important things to do. I thought Mom was having another tantrum. I assumed that come opening day, she'd be off in Lucy Joe's Dart to Davie Elementary, even if we had to cajole her. But on that first day of school, Mom refused to get out of bed. Lori, Brian, and I pulled back the covers and tried to drag her out, but she wouldn't budge. I told her she had responsibilities. I told her child welfare might come down on us again if she wasn't working. She folded her arms across her chest and stared at us. I'm not going to school, she said. Why not? I asked. I'm sick. What's wrong? I asked. My mucus is yellow, Mom said. If everyone who had yellow mucus stayed home, the schools would be pretty empty, I told her. Mom's head snapped up. You can't talk to me like that, she said. I'm your mother. If you want to be treated like a mother, I said, you should act like one. Mom rarely got angry. She was usually either singing or crying, but now her face twisted up with fury. We both knew I had crossed a line, but I didn't care. I'd also changed over the summer. How dare you, she shouted. You're in trouble now, big trouble. I'm telling your dad. Just you wait until he comes home. Mom's threat didn't worry me. The way I saw it, Dad owed me. I'd looked after his kids all summer. I'd kept him in beer and cigarette money, and I'd helped him fleece that miner, Robbie. I figured I had Dad in my back pocket. When I got home from school that afternoon, Mom was still curled up on the sofa bed, a small pile of paperbacks next to her. Dad was sitting at the drafting table, rolling a cigarette. He beckoned to me to follow him into the kitchen. Mom watched us go. Dad closed the door and looked at me gravely. Your mother claims you backtalked her. Yes, I said, it's true. Yes, sir, he corrected me, but I didn't say anything. I'm disappointed in you, he went on. You know damn good and well that you are to respect your parents. Dad, Mom's not sick. She's playing hooky, I said. She has to take her obligations more seriously. She has to grow up a little. Who do you think you are? He asked. She's your mother. Then why doesn't she act like one? I looked at Dad for what felt like a very long moment. Then I blurted out, and why don't you act like a dad? I could see the blood surge into his face. He grabbed me by the arm. You apologize for that. Or what? I asked. Dad shoved me up against the wall. Or by God, I'll show you who's boss around here. His face was inches from mine. What are you going to do to punish me? I asked. Stop taking me to bars? Dad drew back his hand as if to smack me. You watch your mouth, young lady. I can still whip your butt, and don't think I won't. You can't be serious, I said. Dad dropped his hand. He pulled his belt out of the loops of his work pants and wrapped it a couple of times around his knuckles. Apologize to me and your mother, he said. No. Dad raised his belt. Apologize. No. Then bend over. Dad was standing between me and the door. There was no way out except through him. But it never occurred to me to either run or fight. The way I saw it, he was in a tighter spot than I was. He had to back down, because if he sided with Mom and gave me a whipping, he would lose me forever. We stared at each other. Dad seemed to be waiting for me to drop my eyes, to apologize and tell him I was wrong so we could go back to being like we were. But I kept holding his gaze. Finally, to call his bluff, I turned around, bent over slightly, and rested my hands on my knees. I expected him to turn and walk away, but there were 6 stinging blows on the backs of my thighs, each accompanied by a whistle of air. I could feel the welts rising even before I straightened up. I walked out of the kitchen without looking at Dad. Mom was outside the door. She'd been standing there listening to everything. I didn't look at her, but I could see from the corner of my eye her triumphant expression. I bit my lips so I wouldn't cry. As soon as I got outside, I ran up into the woods, pushing tree branches and wild grapevines out of my face. I thought I'd start crying now that I was away from the house, but instead, I threw up. I ate some wild mint to get rid of the taste of bile, and I walked for what felt like hours through the silent hills. The air was clear and cool, and the forest floor was thick with leaves that had fallen from the buckeyes and poplars. Late in the afternoon, I sat down on a tree trunk, leaning forward because the backs of my thighs still stung. All through the long walk, the pain had kept me thinking, and by the time I reached the tree trunk, I had made 2 decisions. The first was that I'd had my last whipping. No one was ever going to do that to me again. The second was that, like Lori, I was going to get out of Welch, the sooner the better, before I finished high school if I could. I had no idea where I would go, but I did know I was going. I also knew it would not be easy. People got stuck in Welch. I'd been counting on Mom and Dad to get us out, but I now knew I had to do it on my own. It would take saving and planning. I decided the next day I'd go to G.C. Murphy and buy a pink plastic piggy bank I'd seen there. I'd put it in the $75 I had managed to save while working at Becker's Jewel Box. It would be the beginning of my escape fund. That fall, 2 guys showed up in Welch who were different from anyone I'd ever met. They were filmmakers from New York City, and they'd been sent to Welch as part of a government program to bring cultural uplift to rural Appalachia. Their names were Ken Fink and Bob Gross. At first, I thought they were joking. Ken Fink and Bob Gross? As far as I was concerned, they might as well have said their names were Ken Stupid and Bob Ugly. But Ken and Bob weren't joking. They didn't think their names were funny at all, and they didn't smile when I asked if they were putting me on. Ken and Bob both talked so fast, their conversation filled with references to people I had never heard of, like Stanley Kubrick and Woody Allen, that it was sometimes hard to follow them. Although they had no sense of humor about their names, Ken and Bob did like to joke a lot. It wasn't the sort of Welch high humor I was used to, Polack jokes and guys cupping their hand under their armpit to make fart noises. Ken and Bob had this smart, competitive way of joking where one would make a wisecrack and the other would have a comeback, and the first would have a retort to the comeback. They could keep it up until my head spun. One weekend, Ken and Bob showed a Swedish film in the school auditorium. It was shot in black and white and had subtitles and a plot heavy on symbolism, so fewer than a dozen people came, even though it was free. Afterward, Lori showed Ken and Bob some of her illustrations. They told her she had talent and said if she was serious about becoming an artist, she needed to go to New York City. It was a place of energy and creativity and intellectual stimulation, the likes of which we'd never seen. It was filled with people who, because they were such unique individuals, didn't fit in anywhere else. That night, Lori and I lay on our rope beds and discussed New York City. The things I had heard always made it sound like a big, noisy place with a lot of pollution and mobs of people in suits elbowing one another on the sidewalks. But Lori began to see New York as a sort of emerald city, this glowing, bustling place at the end of a long road where she could become the person she wanted to be. What Lori liked most about Ken and Bob's description was that the city attracted people who were different. Lori was about as different as it was possible to be in Welch. While almost all the other kids wore jeans, Converse sneakers, and t-shirts, she showed up at school in army boots, a white dress with red polka dots, and a jean jacket with dark poetry she'd painted on the back. The other kids threw bars of soap at her, pushed one another into her, and wrote graffiti about her on the bathroom walls. In return, she cursed them out in Latin. At home, she read and painted late into the night, by candlelight or kerosene lamp if the electricity was turned off. She liked Gothic details, mist hanging over a silent lake, gnarled roots heaving up from the earth, a solitary crow in the branches of a bare tree on the shoreline. I thought Lori was amazing, and I had no doubt she would become a successful artist, but only if she could get to New York. I decided I wanted to go there too, and that winter we came up with a plan. Lori would leave by herself for New York in June, after she graduated. She'd settle in, find a place for us, and I'd follow her as soon as I could. I told Lori about my escape fund, the $75 I'd saved. From now on, I said, it would be our joint fund. We'd take on extra work after school and put everything we earned into the piggy bank. Lori could take it to New York and use it to get established, so that by the time I arrived, everything would be set. Lori had always made very good posters for football rallies, for the plays the drama club put on, and for candidates running for student council. Now she started doing commissioned posters for $1.50 a piece. She was too shy to solicit orders, so I did it for her. Lots of kids at Welch High wanted customized posters to hang in their bedroom walls, of their boyfriend's or girlfriend's name, of their car or their astrological sign or their favorite band. Lori designed the names in big, fat, overlapping three-dimensional letters, like the kind on rock albums, then painted them in day-glow colors, outlined in India ink so the letters popped, and surrounded them with stars and dots and squiggly lines that made the letters seem like they were moving. The posters were so good that word of mouth spread, and soon Lori had such a backlog of orders that she was working until 1 or 2 every morning. I made money babysitting and doing other kids' homework. I did book reports, science essays, and math. I charged $1 per assignment and guaranteed at least an A-, or the customer was entitled to a full refund. After school, I babysat for $1 an hour and could usually do the homework then. I also tutored kids for $2 an hour. We told Brian about the escape fund and he pitched in, even though we hadn't included him in our plans because he was only in the 7th grade. He mowed lawns or chopped wood or cut hillside weeds with a scythe. He worked after school until the sun went down and all day Saturday and Sunday, and came home with his arms and face scratched from the brush he'd cleared. Without looking for thanks or praise, he quietly added his earnings to the pig, which we named Oz. We kept Oz on the old sewing machine in the bedroom. Oz had no plugged hole on the bottom, and the slot on the top was too narrow to work bills out, even if you used a knife. So once you put the money into Oz, it stayed there. We tested it to make sure. We couldn't count the money, but because Oz was translucent, we could see our cash accumulating inside when we held it up to the light. One day that winter, when I came home from school, a gold Cadillac Coupe de Ville was parked in front of the house. I wondered if the welfare agency had found some millionaires to be our foster parents, and they had a ride to take us away. But Dad was inside the house, twirling a set of keys on his finger. He explained that the Cadillac was the new official Walls family vehicle. Mom was carrying on about how it was one thing to live in a 3-room shack with no electricity, since there was a certain dignity in poverty, but to live in a 3-room shack and own a gold Cadillac meant you were bona fide poor white trash. How'd you get it? I asked Dad. One hell of a good poker hand, he said. and an even better bluff. We owned a couple of cars since we'd been in Welch, but they were true buckets of bolts, with shuddering engines and cracked windshields. And as we drove along, we could see the blur of the asphalt through the rusted out floor panels. Those cars never lasted more than a couple of months. And like the Oldsmobile we'd driven from Phoenix, we never named them, much less got them registered and inspected. The Coupe de Ville actually had an unexpired inspection sticker. It was such a beauty that Dad declared the time had come to revive the tradition of naming our cars. That there caddy, he said, strikes me as Elvis. It crossed my mind that Dad ought to sell Elvis and use the money to install an indoor toilet and buy us new clothes. The black leather shoes I had bought for 50 cents at the Dollar General store were held together with safety pins, which I tried to blacken with a magic marker so you wouldn't notice them. I'd also use magic markers to make colored blotches on my legs that I hoped would camouflage the holes in my pants. I figured that was less noticeable than if I sewed on patches. I had one blue pair and one green pair, so my legs, when I took my pants off, were covered with blue and green spots. But Dad loved Elvis too dearly to consider selling it. And the truth was, I loved Elvis almost as much. Elvis was as long and sleek as a racing yacht. It had air conditioning, gold shag upholstery, windows that went up and down with the push of a button, and a working turn signal, so Dad didn't even have to stick his arm out. Every time we drove through town in Elvis, I'd nod graciously and smile at the people on the sidewalk, feeling like an heiress. "You've got true noblesse oblige, mountain goat," Dad would say. Mom grew to love Elvis too. She hadn't gone back to teaching and instead spent her time painting. And on the weekends, we began to drive to craft fairs all through West Virginia. Shows where bearded men in overalls played dulcimers and women in granny dresses sold corncob back scratchers and coal sculptures of black bears and miners. We filled Elvis's trunk with Mom's paintings and tried to sell them at the fairs. Mom also drew pastel portraits on the spot for anyone willing to pay $18, and every now and then she got a commission. We all slept in Elvis on those trips because a lot of times we made only enough money to pay for the gas, or not even that. Still, it felt good to be on the move again. Our trips in Elvis reminded me how easy it was to pick up and move on when the urge struck. Once you'd resolved to go, there was nothing to it at all. As spring approached and the day of Lori's graduation drew closer, I lay awake at night, thinking about her life in New York City. "In exactly 3 months," I said to her, "you'll be living in New York." The following week, I'd say, "In exactly 2 months and 3 weeks, you'll be living in New York." "Would you please shut up?" she said. "You're not nervous, are you?" I asked. "What do you think?" Lori was terrified. She was not sure what she was supposed to do once she got to New York. That had always been the vaguest part of our escape plan. Back in the fall, I had no doubt that she could get a scholarship to one of the city's universities. She'd been a finalist for a National Merit Scholarship, but she'd had to hitchhike into Bluefield to take the test, and she got rattled when the trucker who picked her up put the moves on her. She arrived nearly an hour late and botched the test. Mom, who supported Lori's New York plans and kept saying she wished she were going to the big city herself, suggested that Lori apply to the Cooper Union Art School. Lori put together a portfolio of her drawings and paintings, but just before the submission deadline, she spilled a pot of coffee on them, which made Mom wonder aloud if Lori had a fear of success. Then Lori heard about a scholarship sponsored by a literary society for the student who created the best work of art inspired by one of the geniuses of the English language. She decided to make a clay bust of Shakespeare. She worked on it for a week, using a sharpened popsicle stick to shape the slightly bulging eyes and the goatee and earring and longish hair. When it was finished, it looked exactly like Shakespeare. That night, we were all sitting at the drafting table watching Lori put the final touches on Shakespeare's hair when Dad came home drunk. "That does indeed resemble old Billy," Dad said. "Only thing is, as I've been telling you, he was a goddamn fake." For years, every time Mom brought out Shakespeare's plays, Dad would carry on about how they'd been written not by William Shakespeare of Avon, but by a bunch of people, including someone named the Earl of Oxford, because no single person in Elizabethan England could have had Shakespeare's 30,000 word vocabulary. "All this bunk about little Billy Shakespeare," Dad would say, "the great genius despite his grammar school education, his small Latin and less Greek, was a lot of sentimental mythology." "You're helping perpetuate this fraud," he told Lori. "Dad, it's just a bust," Lori said. "That's the problem," Dad said. He studied the sculpture, then suddenly reached over and smeared off Shakespeare's mouth with his thumb. "What the hell are you doing?" Lori cried out. It's no longer just a bust, Dad said. Now it has symbolic value. You can call it mute Bard. I spent days on that, Lori shouted, and you've ruined it. I elevated it, Dad said. He told Lori he would help her write a paper that would demonstrate that Shakespeare's plays had multiple authors, like Rembrandt's paintings. By God, you'll set the literary world on edge, he said. I don't want to set the world on edge, Lori screamed. I just want to win a stupid little scholarship. God damn it, you're in a horse race, but you're thinking like a sheep, Dad said. Sheep don't win horse races. Lori didn't have the spirit to rework the bust. The next day, she smushed the clay into a big glob and left it on the drafting table. I told Lori that if she hadn't been accepted into an art school by the time she graduated, she should go to New York anyway. She could support herself with the money we'd saved until she found a job, and then she could apply to a school. That became our new plan. Everyone was mad at Dad, which gave him a case of the sulks. He said he didn't know why he even bothered to come home anymore, since he no longer got the slightest bit of appreciation for his ideas. He insisted he wasn't trying to keep Lori for leaving for New York, but if she had the sense that God gave a goose, she would stay. New York is a sorry-ass sinkhole, he said more than once, filled with faggots and rapists. She'd get mugged and find herself on the streets, he warned, forced into prostitution and winding up a drug addict like all those runaway teenagers. I'm only telling you this because I love you, he said, and I don't want to see you hurt. One evening in May, when we'd been saving our money for almost 9 months, I came home with a couple of dollars I'd made babysitting and went into the bedroom to stash them in Oz. The pig was not on the old sewing machine. I began looking through all the junk in the bedroom and finally found Oz on the floor. Someone had slashed him apart with a knife and stolen all the money. I knew it was Dad, but at the same time, I couldn't believe he'd stoop this low. Lori obviously didn't know yet. She was in the living room humming away as she worked on a poster. My first impulse was to hide Oz. I had this wild thought that I could somehow replace the money before Lori discovered it was missing. But I knew how ridiculous that was. 3 of us had spent the better part of a year accumulating the money. It would be impossible for me to replace it in the month before Lori graduated. I went into the living room and stood beside her, trying to think of what to say. She was working on a poster that said Tammy in day-glow colors. After a moment, she looked up. What? She said. Lori could tell by my face that something was wrong. She stood up so abruptly she knocked over a bottle of India ink and ran into the bedroom. I braced myself, expecting to hear a scream, but there was only silence and then a small, broken whimpering. Lori stayed up all night to confront Dad, but he didn't come home. She skipped school the following day in case he returned, but Dad was AWOL for 3 days before we heard him climbing the rickety staircase to the porch. You bastard, Lori shouted. You stole our money. What the goddamn hell are you talking about? Dad asked. And watch your language. He leaned against the door and lit a cigarette. Lori held up the slashed peg and threw it as hard as she could at Dad, but it was empty and nearly weightless. It struck his shoulder lightly, then bounced to the floor. He bent down carefully, as if the floor beneath him could shift at any moment, picked up our ravaged piggy bank, and turned it over in his hands. Someone sure as hell gutted old Oz, didn't they? He turned to me. Jeanette, do you know what happened? He was actually half grinning at me. After the whipping, Dad had jacked up the charm with me, and even though I was planning to leave, he could make me laugh when he tried, and he still considered me an ally. But now I wanted to knock him over the head. You took our money, I said. That's what happened. Well, don't that beat all, Dad said. He started going on about how a man comes home from slaying dragons, trying to keep his family safe, and all he wants in return for his toil and sacrifice is a little love and respect. But it seemed these days that was just too damn much to ask for. He said he didn't take our New York money, but if Lori was hell-bent on leaving in that cesspool, he'd finance her trip himself. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few wadded dollar bills. We just stared at him, so he let the crumpled money fall to the floor. Suit yourself, he said. Why are you doing this to us, Dad? I asked. Why? His face tightened with anger, then he staggered to the sofa bed and passed out. I'll never get out of here, Lori kept saying. I'll never get out of here. You will, I said. I swear it. I believed she would, because I knew that if Lori never got out of Welch, neither would I. I went back to G.C. Murphy the next day and stared at the shelf of piggy banks. They were all either plastic or porcelain or glass, easily broken. I studied a collection of metal boxes with locks and keys. The hinges were too flimsy. Dad could pry them apart. I bought a blue change purse. I wore it on a belt under my clothes at all times. When it got too full, I put the money in a sock that I hid in a hole in the wall below my bunk. We started saving again. But Lori felt too defeated to paint much, and the money didn't come as quickly. A week before school was out, we had only $37.20 in the sock. Then one of the women I'd been babysitting for, a teacher named Mrs. Sanders, told me she and her family were moving back to their hometown in Iowa and asked if I wanted to spend the summer with them there. If I came along and helped look after her 2 toddlers, she said she'd pay me $200 at the end of the summer and buy me a bus ticket back to Welch. I thought about her offer. Take Lori instead of me, I said, and at the end of the summer, buy her a bus ticket to New York City. Mrs. Sanders agreed. Low-lying, pewter-colored clouds rested on the mountaintops around Welch on the morning of Lori's departure. They were there most mornings, and when I noticed them, they reminded me of how isolated and forgotten the town was, a sad, lost place adrift in the clouds. The clouds usually burned away by mid-morning when the sun climbed over the steep hills, but some days, like the one Lori left, they clung to the mountains, and a fine mist formed in the valley that turned your hair and face damp. When the Sanders family pulled up in their station wagon, Lori was ready. She had packed her clothes, her favorite books, and her art supplies in a single cardboard box. She hugged all of us, except Dad. She had refused to speak a word to him since he plundered Oz, promised to write, and climbed into the station wagon. We all stood watching as the car disappeared down Little Hobart Street. Lori never once looked back. I took that as a good sign. When I climbed the staircase to the house, Dad was standing on the porch, smoking a cigarette. "This family is falling apart," he said. "It sure is," I told him.